The red light above camera one blinked on, and the familiar theme music faded into the background. It was a crisp Sunday morning in Manhattan, but inside the sleek, glass-walled studio of Wallace One-on-One, the air was already electric. Chris Wallace, a legend in American journalism, sat poised in his signature chair. His notes meticulously arranged, his gaze sharp and unblinking. Across from him, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett adjusted her navy blue blazer, her expression calm but alert. Ready for what everyone knew would be a high-stakes conversation, the stakes were clear from the start. Crockett, a rising star from Texas's 30th District, had just introduced the Corporate Tax Transparency and Fairness Act, a bill that promised to shake up the way multinational corporations report profits and pay taxes. The proposal had already ignited fierce debate in Washington and beyond, with business groups warning of dire consequences and reform advocates hailing it as a long-overdue step toward accountability. Wallace, known for his relentless pursuit of the truth and his ability to unsettle even the most seasoned politicians, was about to put Crockett's ideas and her composure to the ultimate test. As the camera panned across the minimalist set, the tension was palpable. The studio audience, a cross-section of politically engaged New Yorkers, leaned forward in their seats. Producers and camera operators exchanged glances, knowing that moments like these could go viral in an instant. Wallace wasted no time. "Congresswoman, for viewers who aren't economists, what exactly does your bill do?" he asked, his tone measured but unmistakably challenging. Crockett didn't hesitate. "It closes 3 loopholes that let large corporations report different profit numbers depending on the audience," she explained, her voice clear and steady. "Right now, a company can tell shareholders it made billions in profits, while telling the IRS it made next to nothing. My bill simply requires honest, consistent reporting and stops fake profit shifting to offshore tax havens where no real business happens." Wallace nodded, but his eyes narrowed. "Your critics say this bill would make us companies less competitive internationally. The Chamber of Commerce estimates it could cost as many as 300,000 jobs. How do you respond to that?" It was a classic Wallace move. Lead with the toughest critique. Force the guests to defend their position from the outset. Crockett was ready. "Those numbers come from a flawed study that assumes my bill raises tax rates." "It doesn't," she replied, reaching for a folder on the table. "It just ensures companies pay what they already legally owe. And about competitiveness, let's look at the facts." She flipped open the folder, revealing a color-coded chart. "Here's a list of America's 50 largest companies. The 30 highlighted in yellow paid a lower effective tax rate than their global competitors over the past 5 years. The current system doesn't make them more competitive. It just helps them dodge taxes that smaller U.S. companies have to pay." The audience murmured, impressed by the specificity of her answer. Wallace, momentarily caught off guard by the depth of her preparation, quickly regrouped. "But requiring American companies to pay more taxes than they do now, doesn't that hurt them on the world stage?" He pressed, "Actually, studies from both the International Monetary Fund and the Congressional Research Service show no link between lower corporate tax rates and stronger competitiveness," Crockett countered smoothly. "What truly drives competitiveness is modern infrastructure, quality education, and regulatory stability, all funded by tax revenue." For the next 15 minutes, the exchange followed this steady rhythm. Wallace presented standard critiques of corporate tax reform. Crockett countered each point with specific data, academic research, and concrete examples. Rather than relying on vague statements, she named actual companies, cited tax provisions, and referenced detailed studies. When Wallace argued that her bill might hurt retirement accounts invested in corporate stocks, Crockett pointed out that the Congressional Budget Office had already analyzed potential market impacts and found them minimal. When he warned that it could reduce corporate investment, she referenced 2017 data showing that tax cuts had mostly funded stock buybacks, not job creation or capital expansion. As the discussion reached the halfway point, Wallace's tone began to shift. His trademark technique, exposing inconsistencies in a guest's statements, wasn't working. Crockett's responses were tight, internally consistent, and reinforced by verifiable evidence. The audience, which had started the show divided, was now leaning noticeably toward her side, nodding as she backed every answer with evidence instead of rhetoric. Sensing the need to change tactics, Wallace pivoted. "You've criticized corporations for not paying their fair share, but that phrase, fair share, is subjective. What does it really mean to you?" he asked, moving from data to philosophy. "That's a great question, Chris," Crockett replied evenly. "I define fair share as the amount a company is already required to pay under existing law. My bill doesn't add new taxes. It closes gaps that let corporations avoid paying what's already due. When a small business owner in Dallas ends up with a higher effective tax rate than a multinational firm reporting billions in profits, that's not only unfair, it's economically inefficient. It distorts competition and discourages innovation." Wallace pressed again. "Your bill targets what you call artificial profit shifting, but companies argue they're simply following the law. Isn't this really about changing the rules because you don't like the results?" Crockett didn't miss a beat. "The law already bans profit shifting that lacks real economic activity. The issue is enforcement. If a company claims $10 billion in profit from an office in Bermuda staffed by 3 people, it clearly lacks economic substance. My bill just requires transparency, making those kinds of arrangements visible and accountable." By the 20-minute mark, Wallace's body language revealed growing frustration. His questions came faster, shorter, sharper. Crockett, however, stayed composed, factual, patient, and unflustered. The audience, once skeptical, was now visibly engaged, nodding along as she dismantled each critique with calm authority. The tension in the studio was mounting. But Crockett's demeanor never wavered. She had come prepared, not just with facts and figures, but with a quiet confidence that seemed to unsettle even a veteran like Chris Wallace. The audience could sense it too. There was a subtle shift in the room, a collective realization that this was not going to be a typical Sunday morning sparring match. This was something different, something more substantial. Wallace, sensing that his usual tactics were not yielding the dramatic sound bites that often made headlines, decided to push the conversation into more personal territory. He leaned forward, his voice dropping just enough to signal a change in approach. "Congresswoman, you've often emphasized your background as an economist, but some critics claim you rely more on your identity than your expertise to shield your ideas from scrutiny. How do you respond to that?" The question landed with a thud. It was the kind of loaded inquiry that could easily derail an interview, forcing the guest onto the defensive or into a rhetorical corner. The audience murmured, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Even the production crew, seasoned professionals all, seemed to hold their breath. Crockett paused, her eyes steady on Wallace. "I'm not sure I understand the question, Chris," she said, her tone measured. "Which critics specifically have said that? And what parts of my identity are you referring to?" It was a masterful move, refusing to accept the premise of the question, and instead calmly asking for clarification. Wallace, perhaps realizing he had overstepped, tried to reframe. "There's a perception," he continued, "that when you and others in your party are challenged on the details of your proposals, you sometimes imply that criticism is based on bias rather than genuine disagreement." Crockett nodded, acknowledging the point without conceding ground. "That's interesting, Chris. In this conversation, I've cited the Congressional Budget Office, the International Monetary Fund, Congressional Research Service, and even data from SEC filings. I haven't mentioned anything about personal identity. I'm happy to keep discussing the details of the bill. That's what I came here to do." Her response was direct, unflinching, and rooted in substance. The audience, sensing the gravity of the moment, fell silent. Wallace, for perhaps the first time in the interview, seemed momentarily at a loss. The dynamic had shifted. Crockett was no longer just defending her bill. She was setting the terms of the conversation. But Wallace was not one to back down easily. He regrouped, scanning his notes for another angle. "Congresswoman, let's be honest. Aren't you just playing the race card to avoid answering the real questions?" The words hung in the air, heavy and provocative. The studio froze. Every eye was on Crockett, waiting to see how she would respond to a question that was as much a test of character as of policy. Crockett took a slow, deliberate sip of water, then set her glass down with care. Her expression was composed, her gaze unwavering. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but carried an unmistakable firmness. "Chris," she began, addressing him by his first name, "I've cited 17 economic studies during this interview. I've referred to the Congressional Budget Office's official report on my bill. I've even quoted your previous statements about similar legislation. Not once have I mentioned race. You just did. And I think your viewers deserve to understand why." The silence that followed was profound. Even Wallace, known for his unflappable composure, seemed momentarily unsettled. Crockett continued, her tone steady. "When we discuss tax policy, we should judge it on facts, its merits, its economic impact, its administrative feasibility. That's exactly what I've done today. I've brought data, research, and verifiable examples." She gestured toward the stack of documents beside her. "The numbers don't lie, Chris. The CBO report doesn't have a race or gender. The economic studies I've cited come from institutions across the political spectrum. Either my arguments hold up on their merits, or they don't." The audience, which had been holding its collective breath, erupted in spontaneous applause. It was a rare moment on Wallace One-on-One, a show known for its restrained, almost austere atmosphere. But the response was genuine. A recognition of the clarity and composure Crockett had brought to a moment that could have easily devolved into spectacle. Wallace, now, to his credit, tried to regain control. "Congresswoman, I wasn't suggesting," he began, but Crockett gently interrupted, her tone gracious but firm. "I know you weren't. You're one of the most respected journalists in the country because you focus on substance. That's why your question caught me off guard. It seemed out of character for someone known for serious, fact-based discussion." That was a deft move. Challenging the question without attacking the questioner, and offering Wallace a dignified way to move forward. Wallace paused, nodded slightly, and said quietly, "Fair point, Congresswoman. Let's get back to the bill." "I'd appreciate that," Crockett replied, a faint, polite smile crossing her lips. With the tension diffused, Wallace returned to his usual style, focused, analytical, and policy-driven. "Your bill requires corporations to reconcile their financial statements for shareholders with what they report to the IRS. Critics say that creates unnecessary red tape that could hurt American businesses. How do you respond?" Crockett didn't hesitate. "Actually, most companies already perform these reconciliations internally," she explained, transitioning seamlessly back to substance. "My bill only asks them to submit existing documentation. It doesn't require creating anything new. According to Treasury estimates, the additional cost of compliance is less than 0.01% of the affected company's revenues." She continued, "In fact, several CFOs I've spoken with privately have said they support this provision because it levels the playing field. Right now, companies that follow both the letter and the spirit of the law are at a disadvantage compared to those that use loopholes to dodge taxes. This bill simply makes sure everyone plays by the same rules." For the remaining minutes of the interview, Wallace and Crockett engaged in a calm, thoughtful exchange. The earlier tension had dissolved, replaced by a renewed focus on the heart of the policy debate. The audience, once divided, was now united in their appreciation for a conversation that prioritized substance over spectacle. As the interview entered its final stretch, the atmosphere in the studio had transformed. The initial tension, the sharp exchanges, and the moment of confrontation had all given way to something rare in modern political media, a genuine, respectful dialogue. The audience, still buzzing from Crockett's poised response to Wallace's most provocative question, now listened with a new attentiveness. Even the production crew, who had seen countless interviews come and go, sensed they were witnessing a moment that would be talked about long after the cameras stopped rolling. Wallace, perhaps recognizing the significance of what was unfolding, shifted his approach. His questions became more open-ended, less about catching Crockett off guard and more about understanding the deeper implications of her proposal. "If your bill passes, Congresswoman, what measurable results should Americans expect to see to know it's truly working?" he asked, his tone now genuinely curious. Crockett leaned forward, her hands folded on the table. "3 measurable outcomes, Chris. First, the gap between the effective tax rates of large corporations and small or medium-sized businesses should narrow substantially. Second, multinational companies should show at least a 40% drop in profit shifting to tax havens, as proven by country-by-country financial reporting. And third, annual corporate tax revenue should rise by around $38 billion, all without increasing the statutory rate." She paused, letting the numbers sink in. "Most importantly, these improvements will happen without any harm to legitimate business activity, investment, or job creation, as reflected in major economic indicators. That's the standard I'm holding myself to, and it's the standard I think the American people deserve." Wallace nodded, visibly impressed. "That's a clear set of benchmarks. I wish more lawmakers would be that specific." There was a brief, almost awkward silence, a moment of mutual respect between interviewer and guest. It was as if both recognized that, for once, the conversation had transcended the usual partisan talking points and become something more meaningful as the segment neared its end. Wallace turned to the camera for his closing remarks. But before he could begin, he paused, looking back at Crockett. "Before we wrap up, I want to acknowledge something. Congresswoman Crockett came prepared with facts, research, and real data. Whether you agree with her bill or not, this has been a genuine policy discussion, something our viewers deserve to see." He looked back at her, his expression sincere. "Thank you for bringing such clarity and detail to this conversation." Crockett smiled, her gratitude evident. "Thank you, Chris. That's what Americans want. Real conversations about how policy affects their daily lives, not political theater." The off-air sign lit up, and the studio erupted in a standing ovation. It was a rare sight, not just for Wallace one-on-one, but for any political talk show. Crew members exchanged astonished glances. One staffer whispered, "Did Wallace just admit he was wrong? I've worked here 5 years and never seen that." Later in the green room, Wallace approached Crockett privately. His tone was sincere, almost reflective. "Congresswoman, I've interviewed hundreds of politicians. Very few come as prepared as you did today, and even fewer stay composed when challenged. That was truly impressive." Crockett smiled appreciatively. "I respect that, Chris, and I respect your work. That's why I was surprised by that one question. It didn't sound like you." Wallace nodded, almost sheepish. "You're right. When things don't go as planned, sometimes even seasoned interviewers fall into bad habits. Today reminded me that even after 50 years in this business, I can still learn something." By the time Crockett's flight landed back in Washington that evening, the interview had become a nationwide sensation. Video clips of her calm, fact-based exchange were spreading rapidly across social media platforms, amassing millions of views. Viewers from across the political spectrum praised her command of complex issues and her steady demeanor. Even conservative commentators joined in. "This is how real policy debates should look," wrote one well-known conservative economist on X, formerly Twitter. "Clear data, solid arguments, and no slogans." Whether you agree or disagree, she showed how serious discussions should be handled. Major news outlets spent the next day dissecting the interview. On Morning Joe, Joe Scarborough commented, "That wasn't just a politician handling a tough moment. It was a masterclass in how to bring real substance back into politics." Even on Fox News, a panelist on The Five admitted, "Whatever your stance, Crockett showed up with receipts, facts, figures, and verifiable sources. That's something every voter should demand." The ripple effects went far beyond media praise. Within days, 3 more Republican representatives joined as co-sponsors of Crockett's bill, raising the total to 9, a remarkable show of bipartisan support for tax reform. Senator Hawley, who had introduced the Senate version, publicly applauded her performance. "That's how you defend smart policy with facts, not sound bites," he said. She proved corporate tax fairness isn't a partisan issue. It's an American one. Even the business lobby began to shift. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which had previously opposed the legislation, announced it was reassessing key provisions, acknowledging that some parts may have real merit. A senior industry lobbyist told Politico privately, "After that interview, we can't keep using empty talking points." She exposed exactly where the loopholes are. Either we engage with the facts, or we lose the debate. For Wallace, the moment became a turning point. On a later journalism podcast, he reflected openly. "I've built my career on tough, substantive interviews," he said. "But in that moment, I fell into the trap so many of us do, chasing conflict instead of clarity. When her answers stayed grounded in substance, I should have done the same." The Crockett-Wallace interview would be remembered not for the confrontation, but for how it ended, two professionals reminding a divided nation that facts, respect, and reason still have a place in American public life. The days that followed saw the Crockett-Wallace interview become more than just a trending topic. It became a touchstone for a national conversation about the future of political discourse. Clips of Crockett's.com/fact-driven answers and Wallace's rare moment of self-reflection were shared by millions, not just as political content, but as a model for how public debate could and should be conducted. In classrooms, on podcasts, and across social media, people were asking, why can't more interviews be like this? Journalism schools quickly took notice. Professors at Columbia Northwestern, Stanford assigned the interview as required viewing, dissecting Crockett's rhetorical strategies and Wallace's interviewing style. In one widely shared lecture, a communications expert pointed out, "Notice how Crockett never lets herself be defined by the question. She reframes, she clarifies, and she always brings it back to the facts. That's not just good politics, that's good communication." Students debated the ethics of loaded questions, the responsibility of journalists, and the power of composure under pressure. Meanwhile, in Washington, the impact was even more tangible. The House floor, often a battleground of partisan soundbites, echoed with references to the interview. Lawmakers from both parties cited Crocket's performance as a reason to engage with the substance of her bill rather than defaulting to ideological talking points. When the Corporate Tax Transparency and Fairness Act finally came up for a vote, the debate was markedly different. Instead of the usual grandstanding, members discussed the actual provisions, the data, and the projected outcomes. In a surprise to many, the bill passed with the support of 47 Republicans, a rare bipartisan victory in an era of gridlock. The Senate, too, felt the ripple effect. The companion bill, which had languished in committee, was suddenly thrust into the spotlight. Media coverage of the Crockett-Wallace interview put pressure on senators to take a public stance. After weeks of renewed debate, the bill passed with 62 votes, including 12 Republicans crossing party lines. When President Biden signed the Corporate Tax Transparency and Fairness Act into law, both Crockett and Senator Hawley stood beside him, a striking image of how evidence-based policymaking could transcend party boundaries. The law's implementation set a new benchmark for corporate transparency. For the first time, companies were required to reconcile what they told shareholders with what they reported to tax authorities. The process uncovered significant discrepancies, prompting several major corporations to voluntarily revise their tax strategies to avoid public backlash. By the end of its first year, the legislation had generated $42 billion in additional tax revenue, slightly above Crockett's original projections, without harming business investment, job growth, or competitiveness. Studies from both conservative and progressive think tanks confirmed that the law curbed artificial tax avoidance rather than discouraging legitimate enterprise beyond the numbers. The interview transformed Crockett into a respected national figure recognized for substance rather than sound bites. Invitations poured in from across the ideological spectrum. She spoke at the American Enterprise Institute and the Economic Policy Institute, two organizations rarely featuring the same guests, underscoring her unique credibility. Journalism schools began teaching the interview as a case study, demonstrating how to remain composed under pressure and how to explain intricate policies in ways ordinary viewers could grasp. Crockett's calm, fact-driven communication style became an academic model for how leaders should handle challenging interviews. 6 months later, Chris Wallace invited her back. This time, the focus was her new infrastructure financing proposal. For a journalist known for seldom featuring the same guest twice, the invitation signaled deep professional respect. At the start of their second conversation, Wallace did something unprecedented. "Before we get into your new proposal, Congresswoman," he began, "I want to say something. Our last interview made me think deeply about how we in the media approach complex policy discussions. You raised the bar for both politicians explaining policy and journalists covering it." "I appreciate that," Crockett responded with the same composure and humility that had earned her national admiration. "That's the highest compliment, Chris," she said, "because at the end of the day, it's not about who's asking or answering questions. What matters is whether the American people receive clear, accurate information about policies that affect their lives. That's what we all owe them." Political communication experts later described her first interview as a textbook example of how to diffuse provocation without becoming defensive. One leading textbook summarized it this way: by refusing to accept the premise of a loaded question and keeping the conversation anchored in evidence. Crockett shifted the entire tone of the exchange. Her approach was assertive, but never hostile, principled yet measured. A year later, the new tax law, success evident in stronger revenues and fairer business competition, Forbes featured her on its cover under the headline, "The Crockett Approach: How Substance Triumphed Over Soundbites." The article detailed how her data-driven, transparent communication style had reshaped not only tax reform, but also the national standard for political discourse in an age dominated by outrage and simplification. The piece concluded, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett reminded America that voters can still engage with complexity when it's explained clearly and defended with integrity. Her exchange with Chris Wallace didn't just change one policy debate. It revived faith in the idea that democracy still works when we lead with facts instead of fear. Viewers across the country echoed that sentiment. One popular online comment captured the mood perfectly. "I don't even know if I agree with her bill, but I know I just watched someone who actually understands what she's talking about and can explain it clearly." We need more of that from both parties. That simple remark reflected the deeper legacy of that remarkable morning. The belief that clarity, composure, and genuine expertise could still rise above division. The moment when Congresswoman Crockett met a provocative question with calm substance and left an entire studio in thoughtful silence became not just a viral clip, but a reminder of what American democracy looks like when ideas speak louder than anger.